I loved your appearance on Q&A on Monday night. I thought you were fantastic and you raised some really excellent points that simply don't get enough airtime for the No campaign, especially on the ABC. Now, you stated on Q&A that with the attempt to implement the voice, it felt like we were trying to, quote unquote, fill a void in the nation rather than to address disadvantage. Can you elaborate on that for our viewers?
Well, there's been a bit of a catchphrase, if not now, when, and, this is going to bring about better health, better education. I've seen the billboards around town. The bit that fascinates me is that, and I made this point on Monday night on Q&A, is that every jurisdiction has got an Indigenous Affairs department. Every other department has got an Indigenous Affairs advisory body or function or committee or liaison officers. All the corporates have got, reconciliation action plans. They've got so many ways to engage and deliver culturally appropriate services. So then when I hear the No campaign saying, we're not heard, we don't have a voice, that's not quite what my research shows me when I go Googling, all over the government departments for how Indigenous concerns are being taken into consideration in service delivery.
Exactly. I mean, you yourself were an advisor to John Howard back in the day. I mean, that's just one example of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And after that, there were other functions, if you like, with the Rudd government, and then Turnbull when he was a Prime Minister, and Tony Abbott. There have been advisory bodies, but it's not just at that very high level to the Prime Minister. It's also happening across every jurisdiction as well. So I'm not quite sure how we're going to get technical expertise at a national level, because overcoming Indigenous disadvantage requires, people are going to have to address some really economically, geographically, socially complex problems. So we are going to need the best problem solvers in the country to work on these issues.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, a nationalised, generalised approach, and we'll talk about that later in the interview, for my money doesn't seem to quite make sense when you have so many communities and very complex problems. And look, as I mentioned in my editorial, you pointed out on Q&A as well what I think is quite an inconvenient fact for the Yes campaign, which is that the vast majority, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said about 80% of Indigenous people actually live quite mainstream lives and aren't disadvantaged. What use do those Indigenous people have for an Indigenous voice to Parliament?
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see how many, if the voice gets up, how many Indigenous people participate. Because I actually think, and I actually work in native title and cultural heritage in a part-time role. Not all Indigenous people, practice or it's not obvious that they are expressing their culture on a regular basis. I mean, they could well be just going about their lives, getting on with their day-to-day job in a mainstream suburb. There's plenty of opportunity, at parties or at the football or whatever else to, catch up with your cousins or your family and reaffirm that cultural attachment. But a lot of Indigenous people really do lead very mainstream lives. And Daisy, you're right. Depends on how you slice and dice it, but up to 80% of Indigenous Australians live in metropolitan areas, regional towns. They've got access to all of the services that everyone else has got. Their kids have got, a fantastic choice of schools, mostly, because they've got access to everything that Australia's got to offer.